Hello, everyone. Welcome to the session on market structure analysis, which is the next topic, which is the topic for this session. So, in our earlier session, we discussed the strategic marketing framework and the factors that should influence our marketing actions. So, one of the forces that has a critical bearing on our decisions is competition. So, in this very session, we will analyze the competitive landscape, which is essentially what market structure analysis is all about. So let's just jump right in. Okay, so let us begin by asking and reminding ourselves why it is important to do market structure analysis. So recall that we said that if we are going, in order for us to be successful, if we want to be successful, then our product or service offering must be better than the other offerings out there. So this is the discussion we've had in the previous session. So how can we actually make our product better if we do not have a good understanding of who we are competing with? Because of that's certainly the obvious understanding that we need in order to figure out whether our product is better than the competitor's product. We must have a very good understanding of who are we competing with. And also, as we discussed in our discussion on marketing myopia, we need to maintain focus on the underlying need that the customer is the customer's need that we are trying to satisfy, that our product is satisfying, so that we have a handle on potential threats from other competitors that can actually also satisfy the same underlying need, right? So, for instance, railroads satisfy the need for transportation. So, while other railroad companies are the closest competitors, the need of transportation can be satisfied by trucking companies as well, by airlines as well, and shipping companies as well. So it's really, really important that we identify all our competitors carefully. So, which is why we need to understand the industry that we're operating in. So, how do we define our competition? That becomes a very important question, right? So, first thing, so we can define competition by taking the firm's view. That could be one perspective. So, by taking the firm's view, or we can also take a supply side approach to defining competition. So, for instance, if we look at home appliances category in a department store, now firms might take a product centric view and define their competition by the kind of appliances that they manufacture and sell. Okay, so at a very high level, a manufacturer of a drip coffee maker like Mr. Coffee might think of manufacturers of home appliances as the industry, and then within that, manufacturers of food preparation, such as blenders, food processors, etc., are closer competitors. Now, this would be the product class or product category. Okay, and then within the class of food preparation appliances comes coffee makers, espresso machines, which could be espresso machines, Keurigs, etc., as even closer competitors. Now, these are the different types of product types within within the product types. Now, within each product type, also, there may be different drip coffee manufacturers with different combinations of features and attributes that are the closest substitutes. And hence, the main competitors which come actually are from the product variants and brands. So, they are the most relevant competitors because they're the closest to you. But that doesn't mean that they are the only competitors. Okay, so the next class is your product class. All the different products that belong to the product class or the product category, those manufacturers are also your competitors. And finally, the industry in which you're competing in. So that's also like the big competition that you have to face eventually. Okay, so now that's one approach. Now, an alternate way of thinking about and defining competition is to take a customer-centric view or a demand-side approach. Okay, so what we talked about was the supply side. Now we can take another perspective, which is the demand-side approach. Okay, so because after all, it is the customer who decides what is or not that is a close substitute based on their tastes, based on their needs, based on their preferences. So it's really the customer who makes the final call. And actually, the consideration set in which they put their closest substitutes is also something that the customer decides, right? So this raises the question, why is a consumer purchasing a drip coffee maker? So we have to first understand that. Then we can understand the consideration set. So is it to make regular coffee or to make any caffeinated beverage, or it's just to quench thirst, or is it to, or are they really buying it for maybe a friend, or they're buying it for themselves? So all of these situational influences or some other influences we have to factor in, because at the end of the day, the customer is going to, all the competitors that are going to be part of their consideration set are actually going to depend on what is the need, the customer is trying to satisfy. Okay, so by taking this demand side view, we can define different levels of competition. So, similar to the product centric view, the closest substitutes, if the consumer wants to make regular coffee, is other drip coffee makers, right? Which leads to the product form competition, where manufacturers of other drip coffee makers differ in the combination of attributes and features in their drip coffee makers. So if the customer is in they want to make any caffeinated beverages, then cappuccino makers, maybe espresso machines and percolators will also be considered by the customer, right? And should be viewed as competition. So this is product type competition. Now, if the customer is in the market to make any beverage, so it need not be a caffeinated, any beverage, then juices and water purifiers would also be in their consideration set, right? So this level of competition can be thought of as a generic competition. So, and if the customer is in the market to purchase a gift for a friend, then other home appliances that are priced below the customer's budget should also be viewed as competition, because clearly they're also going to be part of the consideration set based on the budget that the customer has. So the constraint is the budget. So all the different appliances that actually fall in that budget will be part of their consideration set. So this is called the budget level competition. So although the definition of competitors at different levels may be similar to that resulting from the product centric view, right? Because there is some confound there. It's very helpful to understand the consumer's thought process. Okay, it's very, very helpful. If you try and understand consumers' thought process and try and understand different reasons why they buy, what they buy, so this essentially allows us to compete for the customers that are more effectively. We can actually compete for customers certainly more effectively by examining how large each of these segments might be, which is something we will explore in more detail when we discuss consumer analysis, because when we get into consumer analysis, we'll certainly spend some time trying to understand the thought process, consumer thought process, which is really the behavioral. There's a lot of behavioral literature that where the researchers have done stellar studies to understand the consumer's thought process, which is really, really helpful for the marketeers, because at the end of the day, it's the consumer that makes a decision. So with this demand side view, so it's very easy to see that if you look at the cereals, right? So it's easy to see that cereals compete not only with other cereals, but they also compete with eggs, breakfast bars, and other breakfast items, right? So therefore, the competition, when we look at the competitors, it's not, yes, the other cereal manufacturers are also competing with, let's say, Kellogg's cereals, but that's not where the cereal businesses should stop. Then they're being myopic, because they have to understand the industry they're competing with and what is the underlying need that they're trying to satisfy. The underlying need for that particular product is that it's going to satisfy the need for breakfast. Now, for breakfast, cereals may not be the first and the last choice that the consumer may make. They may actually consider several other categories when it comes to consuming breakfast, right? So therefore, eggs, breakfast bars, and other breakfast items also need to be considered. All the manufacturers or the competitors that manufacture these other alternatives are also part of the consumers, may be part of the consumer's consideration set. So we cannot ignore that. Similarly, while P&G, we can talk about another example here. So while P&G has a large share of the laundry detergent market, it only has 20% of the clothes cleaning market. Okay. Again, this is related to the idea of marketing myopia and how one wants to define competition. So once we define different levels of competition, it's critical to anticipate their actions. Why are we doing this exercise? Why do we care about understanding competition? Because at the end of the day, the whole idea is to anticipate their actions, because our best response depends on what our competitors are doing in the market. Okay, so for this, to do this, we need to understand the objectives of our competitors. We also need to understand their current marketing strategies, their strengths, their weaknesses, and also our own company's strengths and weaknesses relative to the competition. So which is what is called the SWOT analysis. Now, SWOT analysis is something that you may have heard of if you've taken an undergrad class in principles of marketing. But this is a very important concept, so we need to make sure that we thoroughly understand what is SWOT analysis. So if I let me expand the form, so it's S stands for strength, then W for weaknesses, O for opportunities, and T for threats. So that's the kind of analysis that we need to do. So why don't we just dive into each of these issues and see how that might impact our marketing mix decisions. Okay, so just like our company, competitors too will have objectives, which is what we just mentioned in the previous slide. So it's important to understand the competitors' objectives and goals, because that will form the basis of their strategies, right? So some very common objectives might be market share growth or even to grow profits. So why this topic is important is because first we understand the objectives, then only we can understand the strategies. Or if we observe their strategies, then we can infer what objectives were they trying to achieve. Because, so like I said, some very common objectives might be market share growth. Some firms want to be the market leaders. For them, maximizing their profits may not be the primary objective, because a strategy to maximize the profits is going to be very different than if you are trying to maximize your market share growth, because the same strategy is not going to work to accomplish both the goals. Okay, so it's important that we understand what our competitors' objectives are, so that we can eventually anticipate what their marketing mix actions are likely to be if they've not made their decisions yet. So now let us say a competitor's objective is to maximize share. So let me just illustrate the same example. So let's just start off by, let's say that the competitor's objective is to maximize share. So what kind of pricing strategy might it adopt? Okay, so think about it. Should you reduce the price and offer a promotion? And what should you reasonably expect the competitor to do in that case? Well, the expectation should be an aggressive price match, right? Because if I'm trying to maximize my market share growth rate, and if I'm trying to reduce the price and I'm trying to offer a promotion to steal the market, what is stopping my competitor to do that, right? So my competitor may also adopt a very aggressive price match, or maybe even a lower price than what I may have offered, to prevent the competitor's share from eroding. So let us say that a competitor's objective is to maximize market share. So what is the right optimal strategy that they should adopt to maximize their market share? Clearly, they can charge a lower price to maximize their share. So let's say they offer a promotion. Let's say you are that player that is trying to maximize the market share, and you have a competitor. So what is the competitor going to do in response to what you've done? So I've cut down the price. Maybe I've offered a promotion. My goal is to maximize market share. Well, my competitor, maybe if their objective is also to maximize market share, then they're also going to match the price, right? So they're also going to go have a further aggressive price match, or even a lower price than what you may have offered, to prevent the competitor's share from eroding. Why? Because the competitor's objective is to market share, is also to grow their market share, right? And nothing can stop them from doing so. So they're going to do everything possibly that they can do to protect their share, right? So what happens? So thinking through the competitor's anticipated response, it may not make so much sense for you now to offer the price reduction. See, because we are making these decisions all in anticipation. So if I cut the price, what is the competitor going to do? They may also cut the price. So who's going to win here? Nobody's going to win here. We are both going to hurt each other's profits. So then because the anticipated response may be that, if the anticipated response is that we are both eroding each other's share and nobody's benefiting out of it, so it may not make sense for you to also offer the price reduction in the first place, right? Because all you've done is lowered price, lowered your margins, and with the competitor's matching price, there is no appreciable increase in demand to warrant the price reduction. So it is really a loss-loss situation for both you and your competitor. Okay? So how do we know what our competitors' objectives are, and what is it that we need to do in anticipation? So that's really the first question. How do I know my competitors' objectives, right? So often firms will make announcements, or they sometimes they have some press releases or some public releases where they state what their goals are, or that if there is a shift in their objectives. Now, if that is not available with industrial products in a B2B setting, so there is a sales literature that is available where your competitors might state their objectives and also explicitly list who their main competitors are. So this can really form the basis of inferring their potential marketing mix actions. So, for example, if a business is considering purchasing a database server, Oracle might come in with their product literature and list other database servers like Microsoft's Access or some other vendors' products to tell the client that these are the vendors we are competing with. So now you can compare these offerings and choose the one that best fits your needs, right? So furthermore, in stating this list, they're also telling the client and their competitors that they will suitably modify their prices and other marketing mix to get the client's business. Okay, so with consumer products, media advertising, particularly comparative advertising, where brands compare their products with the top brands in the category or a close substitute to demonstrate how their product offering or service is better than the competition, is also a very useful way of understanding how the competition might react to changes in your marketing mix. Okay. Now, as far as the product itself is concerned, there's sales literature which is not hard to obtain in B2B markets because there are a lot of white papers that are written that are publicly available. And media advertising can also help us understand what the benefits the competitors' products offer and how our products compare with their offerings. Okay, so now the core strategies and the marketing mix will depend upon the kinds of products the competition offers and who they think they're competing with. Just like we develop our value proposition and differential advantage based on our competitive advantage, we should expect our competition to also do the same. So that's like common knowledge. So that's how we're getting all the information. So the competitors' marketing communications, where they highlight their value proposition and differential advantage, can really be inferred based on their competitive advantage, which brings us to the analysis of the competitors' strengths and weaknesses. So that's how we go and collect all the information, because a lot of information is publicly available, because they are also trying to have some pitch. They're trying to position themselves in a certain way. Well, that's also information to us. So that's really the basis SWOT analysis, because by understanding the competitor's strengths and weaknesses, you can actually figure out what your strengths and weaknesses are. Okay. So essentially, this element of the market structure analysis requires us to understand where the competitor's strengths and weaknesses are. So what I have here is a list of some important areas where competitor may have strengths or weaknesses relative to our company. This by no means is an exhaustive list, and this list can also be industry specific also. So this is not the only list that's available out there. Strengths and weaknesses could be, and this is because that's very specific to the industry you're talking about, to the company you're talking about. So this is not, so this, like I said, by no means is an exhaustive list. So there are so many other different strengths and weaknesses that an organization may have, but I just want to give you some examples here. Okay, so for example, the ability or inability to innovate and design new products can be viewed as a strength or a weakness. Now, a competitor with a strong R&D is more likely to be able to come up with a new product in response to your new offering relative to a competitor that does not have a strong R&D. Okay, in which case that's your competitor's strength. Okay, similarly, a firm that is operating closely to full capacity may not be able to expand its capacity and produce more units unless it has a lot of financial resources. So these constraints or lack thereof will impact a competitor's ability to react to changes in the marketplace, essentially. So we have to understand. So I hope you're understanding how we first of all figure out the strengths and weaknesses, because it's all relative to competition, right? So another one is ability to distribute. So ability to distribute is another area where a competitor may have an advantage or a disadvantage. So a competitor with a large distribution network will be in a position to readily adapt to changes in a market, and a firm with a large distribution network may also face constraints at the same time. For example, a price reduction by a small competitor actually would be very tough for this large competitor to match. Large competitor, by large competitor, I mean the firm with a large distribution network, because this would entail dropping price to a large demand base, which may actually be very costly. Okay, so there are other dimensions on which competition may be strength or weakness. And this is in their financial resources and management personnel. So that's also another dimension. Now, the whole point of analyzing the strengths and weaknesses of the competition is to get an assessment of how the competition is likely to react. So, going back to production capacity, suppose your competitor is operating its plant at full capacity and you lower your price, which is what is their likely response? Well, will they react by lowering their price as well? It's highly unlikely because lowering prices would increase their demand, right? Which they cannot meet since they are already operating at full capacity. So since it is futile for the competition operating at near or full capacity to reduce price. So then that becomes our strength because we can leverage the competitor's weakness in setting our marketing mix decisions, right? So my price can be lower. Our price can be lower than the competitor's price because this is a strength in this case because the competitor does not have the advantage or does not have essentially the advantage of lowering price as well because they're already operating at full capacity. Okay. So again, the point of market structure analysis and the analysis of the strengths and weaknesses of the competition is so that we can leverage our strengths while recognizing our potential weaknesses relative to competition in both anticipating competitors' reactions and setting the right marketing mix actions given that anticipation. So that's really game theory, which is a very interesting subject also. So that's all about strategy. It's all about understanding. So game theory, there are some rules and principles that you learn when you're playing these games in the marketplace. But certainly this helps you evaluate yourself also as a company, what your strengths and weaknesses are. Okay. So now, while doing a SWOT analysis, we also we should also do a self-assessment, right? Like I said, this is a good way to assess yourself. The assessment here is all relative to competition. So when we are looking at our strengths, we should ask sustainable advantage, right? Because today I can see that, okay, there is some strength that I have, which the competitor does not have, so that becomes my strength. But we should ask, is this sustainable advantage or is it something which is very temporary and that the competition can easily overcome maybe over the period of time? This may not even remain a strength, right? Because we are in a very dynamic space here. So similarly, with our relative weaknesses also, we should ask, are we stuck with it or can we do something to overcome the weakness? Perhaps change the product if possible or expand distribution or hire new staff or service personnel to overcome the weakness. Now, any strength or weakness is a strength or weakness only if it is sustainable, as I mentioned earlier. Okay, so what do we mean by that? Say, for example, you charge a lower price than the competition. Is that a strength? It is not a strength if it is not sustainable. So let's try and understand that. That is, if the competitor can readily match it or even undercut it, then it's not a strength. However, it is a strength if your ability to change a lower price results from having a lower cost structure than your competition. Then again, it'll be a strength because then your competitor may not be able to do that. So Walmart has the ability to charge lower prices because it works very hard to keep its cost structure low. Okay, so which is actually their strength? It's really having a low cost structure, which essentially allows them to leverage, maybe they can make higher margins by increasing. They can make higher margins by other ways because they have a low cost structure. So they charge maybe a lower price. So either they can charge a lower margin. So either they make a lower margin and maximize on volume, which is what they're doing, right? So because they have a low cost structure, they can actually reduce the prices. And maybe their competitors may not have a low cost structure. So they may not be able to undercut Walmart's prices. So, but Walmart's margins may get hit, right? But they may actually be making higher profits by the quantity sold. Okay, so they may be actually able to generate higher demand for their products because of that. So in analyzing strengths and weaknesses, it's important to factor in whether they are sustainable in the long run or not, right? Now, in exploring opportunities, we want to look at emerging trends. So that's the next thing. So we've talked enough about strengths, weaknesses. Now let's talk about the other two elements of your SWOT analysis, which is opportunities and threats. So now in exploring opportunities, we want to look at emerging trends. Changes in customers' preferences that we could leverage in growing our business. right? So the fact that a lot of consumers are willing to shop online is a trend, right? So if you do not seek ways to distribute your product online, then you're really missing out on a significant chunk of the market. So to illustrate the impact of changing customer preferences, now think of the automobile market. Not too long ago, anti-lock braking systems (ABS) was only available in high-end luxury cars. Okay, or you could purchase, this option if you paid a significant premium price. Now, this has changed now, as almost every car has ABS. So this has become a comparative necessity, right? If your car has ABS, it does not offer a competitive advantage. On the other hand, if your car does not have an ABS, rather it becomes a competitive disadvantage. So this is how things change, because we are, again, like I said, we are in a dynamic space. What is making sense today may not make so much sense in the next 5 years or 10 years, right? Because things keep changing. Change is the only permanent thing. So we have to keep a track. That's why we have to understand the trends. Okay. Now, under threats, you want to think of a potential new entrant who can satisfy the underlying needs with a technically superior offering or a different technology. And so now the last element of your SWOT analysis is stands for threats. So under threats, you want to think of potential new entrants who can satisfy the same underlying needs with maybe a technically superior offering or a different technology. And we will discuss some of this in our case discussions. Because what are threats really? So threats are also the shocks that all the players that actually get in the industry. So it's not specific to your own organization. It's an external shock. That's a threat. So because there are some trends that are happening outside as well. Maybe the technology is changing, right? So if the technology is changing, maybe your technology is going to become obsolete. So that's a threat. But it's not just a threat for you. It's actually a threat for all the players that are working in the industry. Another example that I'll give you of is that there is a new trend, the growing health consciousness. Consumers are becoming more and more health conscious over the period of time. Recent years, we've seen this trend that has significantly impacted a lot of industries. So think about the food industry, think about the ice cream manufacturers. So how has this impacted? So this is a threat. Growing health consciousness is a threat for all the businesses that are operating in the ice cream industry, because it's not just specific to one player. This is not a threat to one player. This is a threat to all the players that are actually part of that industry. So that's really what threats are. So in order to conduct the SWOT analysis, it's really meaningful. If you want to conduct SWOT analysis in a very meaningful way, we certainly need a lot of information. Okay, so the text essentially lists several sources of information which you can refer to, and some sources of information offer primary information, and there are other sources with secondary data which can be actually used to perform the SWOT analysis. So for that, for the primary and secondary sources of information, please refer your text, because the author has done an outstanding job. So make sure you read the text thoroughly, and that will give you a very good sense of what these primary and secondary sources of information are. Okay, let me move to the next one. So now let's try and understand, like I said, game theory. So I did talk about game theory when we were talking about SWOT analysis, because we are trying to make decisions based on the anticipated actions of our competitors. So therefore, now this kind of thinking wherein the SWOT analysis allows us to infer and anticipate competitors' response can benefit from some ideas on competitive strategy and game theory. So let me start by defining what a game is and what its elements are. Okay, so the elements of a game are: 1, the number of players; 2, the actions or decisions that they can make; and 3, how their actions or decisions influence their payoff. Okay, so once we define the elements of a game, we can then model competitive interactions and engage in a thought experiment if we are willing to make the assumption that the players are rational and will make decisions that are in their best interest. Okay, so as an illustration, we will discuss the prisoner's dilemma game that some of you may be familiar with, but I should add that the game theoretic tools can also be applied to model interactions in more complicated settings, such as distribution channel, where the manufacturer sells its product to the end customer through an intermediary, such as a retailer, And it can be shown, as we will in our distribution session, how that can lead to inefficient decisions when parties act in their self-interest. Okay. Now let us now turn to the prisoner's dilemma game. All right. So in the prisoner's dilemma game, there are two players, A and B, who are alleged to have committed a crime. Okay. So the cops hold them in different rooms and interrogate them. Neither player gets to know what the action of the other player is. Okay, so each player has two actions: confess to the crime or do not confess. The third element of the game is how the actions of each player is related to the payoff. Okay, so the two actions of player A are on the rows, and that of player B are on the columns of the table you're seeing right now. Okay, so the table like this is also called the payoff matrix, and it relates actions to the player's payoff. Now, the first entry in each of the four cells is the payoff of player A, and the second entry is the payoff of player B. So, for instance, if neither A nor B confesses, then both A and B spend half a year in jail and then walk free. If player A confesses and player B does not, this is the second row, first column, then player A spends 0 time in prison while B spends 15 years. Okay? So given the elements of the game, what is the anticipated or equilibrium outcome of this game? To see this, let us fix player B's action to don't confess and ask what is A's optimal response. That is, we compare A's payoff from don't confess, which is half a year, to 0 years if he confesses. A would therefore play confess if B chooses don't confess. Similarly, if we fix B's strategy to confess and ask what is A's optimal response, we will compare A's payoff of 15 years in prison from don't confess to 12 years in prison if he confesses. Now in this game, regardless of B's action, A prefers confess to don't confess. When the optimal action of a player does not depend on the competitor's action, the player is said to have a dominant strategy. Now, in this case, the action of confess dominates the action of don't confess. Okay? So we can go through the same exercise then by fixing A's action to don't confess or confess and ask what is B's optimal response. We will find that, like A, player B also would prefer to confess regardless of what A does. So the equilibrium outcome, or the Nash equilibrium of this game, is both players confess and end up in prison for 12 years. Note that this outcome is significantly worse than both not confessing, but acting in the self-interest leads to this suboptimal outcome. And if there was a credible way of committing to not confessing, then they could collude and get out actually in 6 months instead of 12 years. So this is just like this is a game. So in practice, firms acting in their best interest ends up in market outcomes which may be suboptimal. So researchers have likened promotions to a prisoner's dilemma like a situation. So there is incentive for firm to promote whether or not the competitor does, right? So if the competitor does not promote, you can increase profits by promoting. If your competitor promotes, then you can limit your losses by matching the promotion. Again, promoting your product is a dominant strategy for firms, but if both firms promote, then all you have done is lowered margins without increasing demand, right? So both firms would be better off if they could commit to not promoting. So was meant to be a simple illustration, and I hope it was insightful, of how game theoretic tools can be used to anticipate competitive reactions. As I mentioned earlier, these tools can actually be used in a lot of other contexts as well, which we will talk about later in the course. So I think for this session, we are done, and thank you very much.